All right, welcome to part two of module one for NR 567. This lecture will talk a little bit more about the um, internal structure of NEPA and some of the goals of NEPA in more of a broad view, and then we'll drill down into a lot of these as we move throughout the course. So here's some of the references that we left off with last time that you can check out that provide a good basic understanding and a good basis for NEPA. Okay, so we talked about last time about the political, the social atmosphere, a lot of the contextual stuff that was happening around NEPA. And now we'll actually talk a little bit about kind of the goals of NEPA and the general structure of NEPA. So before NEPA, as we saw, there was a lot of government decisions that were focused on political, desirability, technical feasibility, funding availability, and there was not really any environmental analysis that was being done, no environmental impacts that were being addressed, or any kind of public involvement or public oversight. So the first goal of NEPA was for federal agencies' decision making that they need to disclose what environmental impacts will be taking place. So there needs to be a document that disclosed all these impacts so that they can be fully understood to the public. And then the second goal of NEPA is that the decision making should be open to the public to review and to participate in, which we'll talk a lot about throughout this course. The bottom of the slides shows some of the projects that were completed prior to NEPA and that were environmental impact analyses were not completed. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that there was a time when that was going on. So a general structure of NEPA. So there's the actual statute, which consists about 10 pages, which is more of a broad kind of outline of NEPA as you've seen from your reading and review. And then there's the Council on Environmental Quality, your CEQ, that we'll talk a little bit more about momentarily, which is about 40 pages of documents of regulations around NEPA. And then the third component is this case law component, which is made up of lawsuits and kind of iteratively has addressed NEPA over the years through case law. So some of the key provisions of NEPA, so Section 101, which was accomplished with a bipartisan Congress, a declaration of a national environmental policy acknowledging that there was a human impact on the earth, which is important for the government, as we've seen kind of in this modern era as well, is just an acknowledgement of human impact on the earth can be a big step in a direction for government policy. And so then there's Section 102, which commits the federal government to actually doing something, to analyzing and trying to mitigate adverse environmental impacts before approving a proposed action. And this action forcing requirement. So they have to do something whenever there's going to be some sort of action or some sort of project that's going to take place on federal land. This third key provision was establishing for the executive office of the president the Council on Environmental Quality, or the CEQ, as it will refer to going forward. So some of their key duties are examining the trends in national environment and advise the president on these matters. They also write administrative regulations for all the federal agencies with compliance to NEPA, and oversees implementation and compliance for all the federal agencies. They also oversee the administration of NEPA, and provide the president with policy advice, and can also interpret NEPA if more guidance is needed by a federal agency. So what do we mean by action forcing procedures? So the agency must complete these actions, can produce these documents before a decision is made. So full disclosure happens. So the environmental impacts of proposed action must be disclosed. Unavoidable adverse environmental impacts, alternatives to the proposed action. You'll see in a NEPA document, there's always a proposed action within the document, and then several alternatives. And so, we're also showing the relationship between short-term use with long-term productivity of whatever land is being used, and also the irreversible and irretrievable commitment of resources within the project must be disclosed. And this NEPA, creates this mandate to force these procedures to disclose this information. And NEPA is about procedure, and agencies must follow these procedures that are put in place and regulated or overseen by the CEQ. And so the decisions have to be, rigorous and objective. There has to be citizen involvement in the agency's decisions. And other agencies and governments that are stakeholders within the project need to be involved. And then agency NEPA decisions are subject to court review and scrutiny. And you'll see as you study NEPA that a lot of NEPA decisions are subject to court review and scrutinized. And in fact, the first environmental impact statement prepared by the Forest Service was faced with a lawsuit. This final slide kind of outlines some of the key participants within NEPA, in which we'll get to in more detail throughout the course. But there's a lead agency overseen by the CEQ and somewhat by the EPA, also with a check by the courts on all of these things. And then you also have state and local agencies that are involved. This can be, state parks or any kind of adjacent lands, or sometimes there's projects that overlap different state or even municipalities, with federal land, where there's a lead federal agency, but also state agencies. If something happens on Native American land, there's Native American tribes need to be involved within the NEPA process. There's cooperating agencies, so sometimes there's other federal agencies within one NEPA project. As we talked about earlier, the citizens, the public must be involved. There's sometimes third-party contractors, sometimes there's consultants or other companies that are contracted out by the lead agency to do some of the analyses or any other aspect of NEPA, which we'll talk about in more detail as well. So this ends the second lecture, and we'll see you next time.